Welcome to From the White Pill Box, the podcast where we stomp on statism and find the white pills along the road to a stateless society. I'm your host, Mark Maresca. I'm the author of the Substack articles of the same name, From the White Pill Box, content specifically for the already red-pilled, libertarians, voluntarists, anarchists, people who've overcome the myth of statism or are close to it. It's easy for us to be black-pilled, to believe evil will win. That's where the white pill box comes in. There are real-world reasons to have hope. Let's get going. Greetings, all. Thank you so much for listening today. This episode will be part 12 of my series on the myth of authority. To get a full picture of the content so far, I suggest you review the previous episodes, which I've linked to. Today, we'll continue our discussion about the transition to a free society. In the last episode, I gave an overview of the topic. I explained how the transition is not the simplistic picture we sometimes think. Instead, it's a psychological process. It's essentially the erosion of the myth of authority. And since the myth of authority is the root cause of the state, the decline of the myth harkens the decline of the state. They go hand in hand. But the myth is the center point. The transition doesn't start till the myth starts to get questioned, and the transition ends when the myth is dead. The state's status along the way simply reflects the myth's status. Also, I offered an important white pill. The transition is already underway. You see, the myth of authority has started to be questioned over these last 50 years, in particular with the grounding in the scholarly libertarian and anarchist literature. We have indeed taken the first initial steps into the transition phase, and I covered a few of the misconceptions about the transition. For one, rather than being planned and explicitly obvious, it's actually going to be bottom-up, organic, and generally invisible and non-intrusive. Another misconception, that it'll follow a straight line. Instead, we're seeing the expected very slow start, obviously slow, but this should be followed by an increasing slope of success. Later still, there should be a point where success will be obvious and tangible. And finally, I began defining the state itself in the context of the transition. We'll pick up with that in a minute, but before we continue this deep dive, I want to say a few words about this venture itself into the topic of the transition to a free society. If you're familiar with my work, my essays or podcasts, you probably know most of my work is not speculative. I always try to ground my conclusions in reality. Remember that I'm trying to uncover the white pills out there. Well, if I'm going to declare something as a white pill, I want it to be as realistic as possible. I don't want to come off as simply looking at the glass half full, just seeing the sunny side of life. No, I want the reader or listener to see the white pill as vividly as they see anything else right in front of their nose. For example, I've said that the state, as a massively evil institution, can fall and do it quickly and do it quietly. But I didn't just assert that. I used a real-world example of how this could actually happen, the Soviet Union. And if you lived through that time, you'll remember that no one would have believed it possible for the USSR to dissolve. But it did, and quickly and fairly quietly. That's the grounding I'm talking about. Well, that's why so much of my work deals with the world as it is, right now, the world we live in, reality. Well, that's what makes this topic a bit different, the transition to a free society. Even if I'm right that it has already begun, then at best, it's only barely started. Most of it is ahead of us. And since the future is always uncertain, it does make this examination largely speculative. It's for that reason that I'm going to tell this more like a story, the story of the transition from statism to a free society. Not fictional, more of a best guess that's as grounded in reality as possible. The story starts about now when the transition is just getting off its feet. if the reasoning is sound and we stay grounded, we'll find that we are currently at the black pill part of the story, the riskiest stage, where everything seems against us and the state is the strongest, most confident, and even reckless. Well, obviously, if statism is at its strongest now, then it will be less strong later. And it makes sense. Of course, the state is strongest now. The myth of authority is strongest now. But if the myth has started to weaken, and that's hardly a big if, folks, the myth is weakening, then the state will weaken too. Anyway, with or without my contributions, this will be a story someday. The myth will eventually disappear and the world will be stateless. Then, finally, there'll be an actual historical chronicle of what ended up happening. There will be the real story. So, let's see how close we get. The story has two main groups of players, the state and everyone else. We're going to examine both groups today. As far as the state, last episode I started discussing the overall number of people that comprise the state, specifically in the United States. It's 24 million. This includes people in all government bodies at all job roles, like law enforcement, politicians, bureaucrats, all support and maintenance roles of all kinds, about 9% of the adult population. Then there's everyone else, everyone not part of the state. The U.S. totals about 334 to 335 million people. So subtracting that 24 million, we get about 310 million people who are not part of the state. Now, it's true that there's about 22% who are minors, but the state rules them too, so they do count. So those are the starting numbers at the big picture. 24 million working for the state, 310 million who are not. Now we'll drill down regarding the state, where right away we have to do some grown-up thinking. We're indoctrinated to use generalities like the state or the government, and that's when the steel doors in our minds slam shut. Sorry, not here. Start with the important distinction. There's the state as a whole, as we often think of it, this giant, massive thing that we libertarians hate and the statists worship. Yeah, that one big thing, distinct from the individuals who make it up, humans just like you and me, those actual, living, breathing 24 million people. It's important because this story is all about things like psychology, how people will think or act. Remember, people think, people act, people respond. Big blobs of people do not. The state as a whole is not a thinking entity or an acting entity. Psychology, thoughts, and actions are meaningless regarding the state as a whole. Now, I'm going to use several different ways to say that same thing here, to drive it home, because we have to purge our minds of imagining the state as a thinking entity. This analysis we're doing of how the transition to a free society will play out, this will be one big waste of time if we speak like statists, if we only talk about how the state will think or act as if it really is a thinking entity. So here we go. Let's all remember, the thing we call the state, that whole apparatus, has no single collective brain. It does not think. There's no one there, as we say. No representative mind in charge, thinking on its behalf. The state is untethered from a mind. You'll often hear me calling it a runaway train or an avalanche. So the state can't have a conscious point of view. Take that in, because it's a big white pill. The state is incapable of even knowing a transition is happening. It's clueless, precisely because it's mindless. It won't understand what's going on, which disables it from strategically responding, again, as a whole. Okay, done. I know I beat that to death, which brings us to the obvious next question, a valid one. namely, that anyway, there will be people in the state thinking and reacting during the transition. So how about those 24 million state employees? Well, guess what? It's just as invalid to have a number like that in our minds, 24 million people, and then attribute thoughts and actions to that group. Same thing. That group doesn't think or act either as a collective whole. So we have even more work to do. Otherwise, we attribute to those 24 million the same imaginary powers of human thought as we mistakenly attribute to the whole of the state. So, those 24 million are people. Individually, they do think and act. What are their motivations and goals? It's important to ask that because those 24 million are not one big brain with one big statist plan. They're not a single hive mind whose thoughts encompass the collective needs of a nation. No, they're just like us. Like all humans, they have their individual, personal concerns and interests in life. Their minds sense what seems best for themselves, or maybe for their immediate group, and they act accordingly. Now, yes, some of their actions may sometimes align with the interests of the state as a whole. But this is an important strategic distinction. Within the state, there are 24 million people in play, all focused on their self-oriented interests. And to be blunt, plenty of them are just keeping seats warm and collecting benefits. Sure, plenty of them crave wealth and crave power over people. But the point is, like all humans, all are self-oriented, not acting strategically for the composite totality of the state. They are like 24 million tapeworms eating a body from the inside. They don't share and play nice. No, each one is serving its own interest. Zoom out, and you see they're all uncoordinated. That's the people within the state. To put it another way, this analysis operates from two premises: that the state as a whole is mindless, and that no one, or even a small group in the state, has meaningful power over the whole. There's no one in the apparatus thinking for the whole. Therefore, we, in thinking through the dynamics of the transition, don't need to analyze what the state as a whole would do. The collective state will be a clueless bystander all the way. So the only thinking and acting that happens in the state is by individuals within it. And even then, they have their own particular, specific scope of influence. They prize their power within the borders of that scope. That's where their incentives lie. In a nutshell, no one speaks for the state. Literally, no one. So now let's return to those 24 million people, because I'll tell you, this is one of those things that seems to keep libertarians and anarchists black-pilled. What they perceive as enormous state numbers. They seem to have a picture of the Empire in Star Wars, those scenes with legions of troops, as if this fictional image reflects reality. Well, I hope this next white pill about the numbers will permanently change how you look at the road ahead. Those 24 million? Most of them don't even count in this analysis. They offer zero help to the state in the transition. Why? Because most are doing work they would just as easily do outside of government. Work that actually has value in the private sphere. Accounting, legal work, computer work, hiring, inventory, cooking, cleaning, and it goes on. Yes, they cash a paycheck, so sure, they are recipients of the stolen tax loot, but their role does not make them an immediate personal threat. The key attribute that makes them not a threat is this: they do not have state power at their personal command. Now, some do. Law enforcers do. Also, anyone who can call in law enforcers whenever they want, like the way politicians can, or how judges or prosecutors can. But everyone else, those accountants, HR staff, supply people, these are all support type roles. maintenance, admin, operations, or technical support, supplies. For simplicity, I'm going to call them the state clerks, just to give them a label. The state clerks. So these clerks, yes, are part of the state, but they're dead weight in terms of state power. Clerks are not enforcers, and they don't have cops at their personal command. So now we can put a realistic meaning to the idea of people in the state thinking or acting or responding. Those clerks among those 24 million can't do anything more than you can. You can't dispatch a cop, right? Well, neither can any government accountant, computer geek, inventory manager, trainer, mechanic, janitor. You get the idea? They have roles that are really no different from their counterparts in private employment. Well, during the transition to a free society, their thoughts, their actions, their responses are fully constrained by their narrow role. And that constraint just happens to match up with you and everyone else outside the state. If you're, say, a private accountant now, then during the transition, you will obviously still be an accountant. Well, same for an accountant employed by the state. The transition does not endow the state accountant with more power. So that massive group of state clerks are not part of the transition. Sure, the state is their employer, but in their jobs, they don't influence anything. They don't enforce, and they don't have enforcers on speed dial. They don't count, and they are the majority in the state. But of course, it's totally different for a politician, a cop, a soldier, a judge, a prosecutor. These people hold genuine power over others in their jobs that don't even exist in the private sphere. So let's name this group. I'm calling them the state bullies. I think you're going to like this term. These are the people who have the direct power of a gun available. They're personally armed, or they can dispatch an armed enforcer when they like. Again, the politicians, the high-level bureaucrats, law enforcement, and military. The people who do count in the transition. The people who either have the actual guns for enforcement or have them on speed dial. So let's count them. Let's go through actual numbers to estimate those with true state power. How many state bullies? Start with the actual enforcers. We are, again, not simply talking about all the people employed by police or military. No, we're counting only those trained to physically use arms. They're just a subset. There's a whole lot more who are the clerks, as we're calling them. Accountants, maintenance staff, etc. All those support roles don't count because they aren't trained and armed. So what are the true numbers? Well under 2 million people are trained and armed to enforce laws, and that counts both military and law enforcement at all levels, including National Guard. I also included officers in command roles. So altogether, just shy of 2 million. Okay, with the enforcers counted, now let's account for the people who, while not enforcers, still have power. That's politicians at all levels of government, plus judges, prosecutors, and upper management in all those government bureaucracies, like the FBI and CIA. Like I say, anyone who can call out the enforcers. For kicks, I even added in those with real influence in academia, the major media, and banking. This way we haven't ignored the state's handmaidens. Best I can estimate, the total of all these people with power comes to about 700,000. So 700,000 plus fewer than 2 million armed enforcers comes to less than 2.7 million. I decided just to eliminate any questions to just round that up to a clean 3 million. So best guess, there are about 3 million people in the United States, 3 million individual human beings who either enforce the state's rules personally, or they can call out those enforcers whenever they need them. So now we can focus on the realistic numbers, not the 24 million holding down any statist-related job because clerks can't threaten you. It's the 3 million people who can actually, legally, push people around in a big way. They hold the actual enforceable power and can use it. Those 3 million are the state bullies. 3 million bullies. Now I want that number to sink in, but not before I return to the other players in the story, the majority who are not part of the state. Remember that 310 million. Now, for purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to count libertarians and anarchists who are red-pilled. We'll just assume all 310 million non-state employed people, even you and me, believe the myth of authority. The story of the transition is essentially how the battle plays out between the myth of authority and statism. In terms of people, this means the majority against the 3 million state bullies. Now let's get real clear on the majority. We counted 310 million people not employed by the state. But wait, we're forgetting those people who are employed by the state who aren't the bullies. Remember those clerks? They're the 24 million state employees minus the 3 million bullies, about 21 million. For simplicity, I'll just say it's an even 20 million clerks. Those accountants and janitors and maintenance folks, remember, they buy into the myth of authority too. And the state bullies have them in their sights just as much as you. The state clerks are bossed around and regulated and propagandized just like you. And like you, they have no cops on speed dial. Bottom line, same as those 310 million who do not work for the state, the 20 million clerks are also victims of the myth of authority. Folks, this story is actually not about a battle between everyone in the state against everyone not in the state. It's between everyone who believes the myth against the people born out of the afterbirth of the myth, the state bullies. And that number is the 310 million outside the state plus the 20 million clerks in the state, meaning 330 million. 330 million myth followers against 3 million myth enforcers, 3 million bullies. 3 million against 330 million. This works out to about one person in authority over every 110 people. One person with the authority to coerce 110. 110 people governed by one guy. That's what it means for 330 million people to be governed by 3 million. Now think about that. If you wonder how it can be possible that 330 million people can have their lives ruled by a mere 3 million, it's not that hard to see if you've followed this podcast series. It's the myth of authority. They believe it's okay to be ruled. They expect it. They want it. They are willing to fund it. It wouldn't be possible if they didn't want it. It's the only way 110 people could allow one person to subjugate them. They've all got to want it. That's frustrating, isn't it? Just thinking about how the myth of authority gives us 110 people willing to exist under the thumb of one. But then we have a great white pill from that. Those 110 only have to worry about one person. Or in total terms, there are only 3 million bullies, a pitiful number against 330 million. Whatever details make up the transition, the work to be done only needs to deal with 3 million bullies. Now, real quickly, a few words about why I picked the term bully. There's several reasons. For one, it's true. They are bullies. Their power permits them to pose a personal threat to actual real people. And that word, bully, helps make them real. It personifies them. It helps remind us they are actual people. They're not at all that general collective blob we call the state. They're this small human subset of it. They're the ones who can actually think, act, and respond in the story of the transition. Though even they're not acting collectively. They are still tapeworms, feeding themselves and uncoordinated. So let's wrap up. As far as the state, I made painfully clear the state has no one brain, so it can't think, which leaves the only meaningful question about state actions: who exactly influences it? Well, it's not the 310 million outside the state, and not the 20 million powerless clerks in the state. It's only those 3 million bullies. And even that group doesn't operate under a collective hive brain. You'll recall I started by saying that the story has two main groups of players: the state and everyone else. So now we can better picture them. The state as 3 million bullies, and everyone else, 330 million myth believers. And isn't that a great white pill takeaway? The myth of authority's creation, the state, is nothing other than this slice of people, 3 million bullies, the only human threats that count during the transition. So we'll stop there for today, but rest assured there's tons more to say about this. Until then, take care and see you next time. Many thanks to Substack for hosting my podcast and my articles. And thanks especially to you for listening. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.